Hi, I'm M.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Well, hello.
Hello, M. How are you?
I am fantastic. It is the very last episode of our Tropetober series.
Kind of sad.
Yeah, it is kind of sad. We don't get to talk about, like, scary stuff in depth or anything until next October. It's so sad.
But we can look forward to it next October.
We already have ideas for literally every episode of that month. I am so excited. You're just gonna have to wait a whole year, listeners. What are we talking about in today's devilishly fun episode, Bea?
We are going to talk about Nosferatu.
That sounds fun and weird, and also Nosferatu.
It's a good
Stop
movie.
turning off the light. Sorry, SpongeBob reference. You know, another name for what we're talking about today is Dracula.
Well, one specific person who has to do with things.
Vampires! Vampires. We're talking about vampires. If you haven't already read the title, we're talking about vampires. Vampires are weird, especially today. People have some strong opinions about vampires as a fictional monster.
Boy, howdy.
So much opinion.
That pendulum is swinging back and forth so hard. It's actually kind of fun to watch.
Yes, and it's kind of also fun to be part of the pendulum, which I will talk about later. So let's get into kind of the history of fictional vampires and stories. Basically, I read this really interesting article called The Long and Bloody History of Vampires in Literature by Tracy Mumford, and Tracy found some wonderful stuff in literature, and I am going to distill it here for you. So there was a time in which quite a few people from Serbia believed that vampires existed. And there are a number of people in the world today that also believe that. There are different types of vampires, different types of lore for people. But I guess most people would think that vampires aren't really a real thing. But in the 1700s in Serbia, people were really terrified of vampires. The first vampire stories, like folklore, came from Serbia in the mid-1700s. They were really worried about these creatures that would come into the night and, like, throttle you, and those creatures were past loved ones, dead loved ones, basically.
That's not a good look on anybody.
Isn't.
If you've gained undeath, don't immediately go and murder your family. Don't do it.
It wasn't exactly instant kill from these creatures. It was like within a week you would die after experiencing the creature in your room or seeing somebody come at you in your room and it was an undead, like, past family member. So it was one of those kinds of things, like, you know, maybe they died from being so scared, you know, maybe, but it's fine. That's like the folklore of Serbia. And the people in these towns would go and they were like, are the bodies still in there? in their coffins? Like, we saw them out and about in our rooms at night, and they would go get those bodies out of the ground, and they were like, classic vampire, because it was like their nails were longer and they had blood in their mouths and they hadn't decomposed, apparently. And I don't know how long they were in the ground, so it's like, you know, this could all just be hearsay. I have no idea. But that's where the myth of vampires comes from, at least in, you know, English. I'm not sure entirely if, you know, Egyptians had vampire myths, but alas.
I kind of love the fact, though, that they were perfectly willing to believe that these corpses could overcome the power of death, but they couldn't translocate. Like, they actually physically had to move. There was no mysticism involved. It wasn't a ghost. It was these corpses physically got up and moved. That's the way it made sense.
Well, you know, humans. Anyway, there was the first poem that we can find about vampires is a poem called The Vampire. It was published in 1748, and it was a Germanic poem by Heinrich August Ossenfelder, and this is just a short little snippet of it. And as softly thou art sleeping, to thee shall I come creeping, and thy life blood drain away. Creepy. So fun.
I like the idea of a vampire just straight up writing poetry, very literal poetry, and then sending it off to their victim. Like, here,
Yeah, it's kind of sexy. Kind of hot. So, yeah. Then there was the first English poem about a vampire called Thalaba the Destroyer. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. By Robert Southey. It's a classic case of undead wife coming after the husband, who happens to also be the hero of the story, but like I also am
That
kind of
seems
in the corner of the
unlikely.
undead wife.
I'm gonna quote some women's solidarity there. He probably deserved it.
He probably did. So basically, after that, a big old crazy thing happened in the world of literature. And that was the Lake Geneva house story thing that happened, where Mary Shelley and Lord Byron and his doctor and another Mary Shelley's husband,
Percy Shelley.
they were all, thank you, they were all stuck in a house, and Lord Byron was just like, hey, what if we all write ghost stories while we're stuck here just to like pass the time? And that's where Frankenstein was written, and that's where The Vampire was written, which was like the first story that had like a classy vampire in it. And at first it was attributed to Lord Byron, but it was actually written by his doctor who was there, John Polidori. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. And it was published in 1819, which is 3 years after the Lake Geneva story thing happened. And previously, before that story, vampires were written like random townspeople who were kind of like zombies, actually. They didn't have much personality. They just were there to suck your blood.
They were just sort of an impersonal monster.
Yeah, exactly. There was no personality to them. And super interesting that we also have an episode in this Tropetober about zombies, and then we're talking about this too, which is kind of fun. And then after that, in 1872, there was Carmilla, which is about a young woman who falls prey for a vampire in a castle. And that was written 25 years before Dracula. So that's kind of interesting that they're both very similar.
Could possibly Stoker,
25 years after.
Could Stoker possibly have read this book or something like it and drawn some inspiration, maybe?
Yeah, probably. Also feels very fan-fiction-y. But yeah, he wrote Dracula, and the character of Count Dracula has been in over like 200 films, which I love that little thing. And then there was Interview with a Vampire in 1976. And that was the first story that made vampires sexy / sensual. Thank you, Mary Shelley. Or sorry, thank you, Anne Rice. Well, thank you, Mary Shelley, but also thank you, Anne Rice. I actually have an original 1976 version of Interview with a Vampire that I found at a thrift store for $3. And oh my god, it's one of my favorite possessions.
So, at the end of the day, I love mythological things. I love me some fantasy AU, but vampires are not ever gonna top the list for me. I don't dislike them. They're just never going to be my favorite, especially in mainstream. I grew up in the Twilight hype, which we will talk about a little bit later, and it sort of rolled right over me and burned me out a little bit. I am fatigued. But in college, I read in one of my classes a book it's called The Gilda Stories by Jewel Gomez. And it sort of ruined every other vampire story for me because it is everything I could have ever wanted out of a vampire story and then some. And until it has been met and exceeded, I'm not sure I can really have a true fondness for it. It is a historical novel for the most part. It actually spans this huge breadth of time, and it's about a slave girl who ends up running away and falling in with a pair of women who are vampires and lovers. She ends up this main character, Gilda, ends up becoming a vampire too, and she also is a lesbian. And the stories are about her living through time and all of her different experiences and the people she meets and the people she falls in love with. And it's this beautiful, interesting, introspective look at what some of the subtext of being a vampire means and what being a vampire means when you are not a beautiful, sparkly white man. It is a woman of color living through history with all the goods and bads, and kind of, because she is more or less immortal, she's a little bit outside of it. It's a wonderful story. It's really long. It takes a while to get through, but it means that I'm a little bit, perhaps one could say, overcritical at times of the rest of the trope. Because of that, I'm like, this is it. This is the one thing that is everything I could have wanted, and now I'm going to be sort of sad about everything else.
It was written in 1991, so it's not like a response to Twilight.
No, it's not a response to Twilight. It's not even really a response to the 90s Interview with a Vampire. It's sort of a it is in conversation with the trope as a whole in the last 100 years, with the idea of specifically it being white men and these enormous queer subtext that is involved in vampire stories. Because not to delve into some deep literary criticism, but I think we can all agree that there's some strong penetrative imagery that happens with vampires. And if you've read the first bit of Dracula, yeah, Dracula was definitely had some subtext with Harker, and the fact that it's acceptable after a fashion because he is a vampire and because he's already being transgressive in other ways. Like, you could literally take a college course on just this subject. But it's really, the Guild of Stories is very interesting for how it takes on some of those themes. Again, most vampire stories are kind of for fun, and that's pretty heavy, so.
Yeah, that's very cool. I do want to read that book now, but I am a person of my age, okay? Like of my time. I was 11 years old when I started reading the Twilight books. 11 years old was a really big age for me. Big year for me. I started reading a lot of books at that time, and Twilight was poised to be there for me to read constantly. I still have the books. I read them, once every couple years. I think they're fun to read because it reminds me of being a young person and in middle school and all that jazz. I also lived in the Pacific Northwest at the time, so it was a little bit perfect. I understand the folly of thinking that it's an amazing story. It's not the most amazing story of all time, but I really super duper enjoy them as a person, and I still watch the movies sometimes with my mom. She really got into Twilight. She started reading them because she wanted to make sure that I, as an 11-year-old, was reading something that was age appropriate for me. And they are. I'd say that they are.
Mhm.
I wasn't, scarred or anything by reading the odd little sex scenes in Breaking Dawn.
Odd being the
But
optimum word.
especially after reading so much fan fiction. But she was the one who introduced me to fan fiction as a whole because of Twilight. She got into fan fiction because of Twilight after spending some time on the internet, which was the first time she ever got on the internet. I know I'm talking a lot about my mom, but she basically found these stories and was like, Miranda, you would really like them. And I was about 15 or 16 at the time, and then I started reading Lemons for the first time in my life, and it was very interesting. And then I got into Tumblr because I kept hearing about this thing called Tumblr and fanfiction, and then the rest is history. This podcast exists because my mother got into Twilight, basically. So without Twilight, I wouldn't be who I am, and the vampire trope wouldn't exist. It is not a perfect story in it by any means, but I really like them. I know that they're not necessarily vampires in the strictest definition of it before Twilight came out. They're vegetarian vampires who happen to sparkle in the sunlight. But yeah, I don't like it when people just automatically dislike something because young women love it. People make fun of fan fiction because of that. So I'm all for Twilight here. We like Twilight in this house, basically. Some weird information about Twilight AUs that I have found. A lot of the Twilight AUs, or a lot of the Twilight fics that exist that I have read, it's not like taking the characters from Twilight and then putting them in other universes, like a Pride and Prejudice AU. You never see Bella and Edward in Pride and Prejudice or Titanic or something like that. And you never see other characters from other TV shows going into the Twilight universe. Like, you don't see Steric in the molds of Bella and Edward. I was about to say Ella and Bedward. You never see those characters in the Twilight universe of the books or the films. You never see that. Essentially what you see are Bella and Edward in modern times. And that's why 50 Shades of Grey exists, because that's what E.L. James was writing. So I think that's interesting.
It's weirdly self-contained.
Very self-contained, and that Bella and Edward are just not interesting enough characters for fanfic writers to put in different universes. I think that's it's saying something.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's saying, but it's saying something.
It's saying that a lot of their interest stems from their roles, I guess. Like,
and the world that they're in.
Yeah, if you took them outside of that, then they are definitely lacking something.
Yeah, and when I was reading the fic when I was 15 or 16, them just modern AU, it was really hard for me to visualize them as people, because in order for them to be interesting in a modern era that isn't about vampires or werewolves or anything like that, you really have to make them kind of different people in your brain. The characterization isn't spot on. So in my head, I was like, this is just not Bella and Edward, but I'm just reading a story that has Bella and Edward names in it, basically. Even at 16, that's what I felt. But yeah, so that's it. That's basically it about Twilight. We don't have to continue talking about that anymore.
You can't talk about fandom history, and you can't talk about
No,
vampire
you can't.
trope without talking about it. It just, that would be
Yeah,
ignoring such a
especially
large chunk of Finnish history.
especially when we're talking about Finnish history regarding me. So yeah, okay. Tropes. We have some weird tropes.
That's because, in our experience, and we will freely admit that collectively we are not the greatest reader of this trope.
We're not. We aren't the greatest readers of any of the tropes that we've talked about in this whole month, but we needed to talk about them, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We've definitely read some vampire AU. Who hasn't?
This is going to be things that we've encountered on, like, even if it's weirdly specific, more than one instance. So we felt it was worth talking about for that, if nothing else.
So, two mythical creatures meet in a bar and neither knows the other for what it is.
And this bar
Sounds
is
like the beginning of a joke.
Yes, absolutely. and in this case, the bar is metaphoric. Like, it doesn't literally have to be a bar. It's they meet somewhere in some instance, and they don't know. And it weirdly often is vampires and something else. I've seen vampires and werewolves, which is pretty common. I've seen vampires and dragons. I've seen vampires and demons. It's kind of odd.
Vampires and demons are so close together.
Yeah.
In like lore. I don't know why people would write that, but I mean,
technically, you could argue vampires are a type of demon, so.
Yes, and if demons eat people, you could technically argue that they are also vampires.
Complicated.
So, yeah.
These are usually rom-coms.
Do you want to say? Yeah, they are actually usually romantic comedies type fanfic.
Yeah, it's these two characters find each other and they end up falling in love, but it comes with two different, I've seen different versions, but the two big versions that I've seen are either it's a comedy of errors where they end up accidentally completing some kind of marriage rite between the two of them that they culturally don't know about, and then they're like,
yes,
oh no, we got married, and only one of them knows this, and it's weird, and it's hilarious. Or two, and this one's a little bit more common, it's where the vampire character thinks that this person is going to be their next mark, and they're going to feed on them, and the other character thinks that the vampire is their next mark, and they're going to do whatever it is they're going to do with them. So they both think they're hunting the other one. Again, comedy of error style, they sort of blunder their way into not doing that, and then also kind of being friends. And that one can be played for more or less laughs depending on the author.
Yeah, instead of killing each other, they make out.
Or just get really annoyed and yell at each other.
That's also a thing, and then ultimately it ends up to making out. But yeah, I love that trope. It is so fun. You also see vampire hunter vampire. Mm-hmm. That's also a thing, which is super fun. I've seen a couple of specifically Stucky AUs where either Steve is a vampire hunter and Bucky is a vampire, or Steve is a vampire and accidentally marries Bucky. I've seen that a couple of times too. It's so weird. But yeah, a lot of Stucky vampire fics exist. Anyway, what's the next trope, B?
So the next trope is, and this one is a lot more broad strokes because there are a lot of fics that could fall under this category, but they're vampires, but also the entire fic is set in some historical time period. It's usually sort of Bram Stokery, ambiguously Victorian. Sometimes it's Regency. You could also set it in like Rome or in medieval Europe, Fantasyland. And these are usually done for one of two reasons. Either it is basically a historical AU with a little bit of vampire spice sprinkled on top for fun, or the other one that I find a little bit more interesting as a twist, I guess, is where they start off in a historical period, then the vampire character ends up traveling through time in the normal fashion, being at least quasi-immortal up to a point, and because of time travel, either the other character they're supposed to fall in love with ends up kind of hopping into the future, so Man Out of Time, Captain America style, where in this instance the Captain America would have been jumped from point A to B, but if Bucky was a vampire and not the Winter Soldier, he would have just lived through time normally. Or through shenanigans, the person that they fall in love with is already from the future and they traveled back in time and then traveled back to their own present. And then the vampire meets them in the past, falls in love with them, and then ends up in the future and they fall in love and have a happily ever after. So it's sort of a time travel fix-it thing. It can be really cute.
I really like that. I also like it when vampires are like live long time and then like, find their love like way after they would have died originally as a human. So vampires versus werewolves.
It's a thing. Oh, it is a
Yep,
trope.
it's a thing. I do want to say before we get into that there is this really cute book called Fangs by Sarah Anderson, who also writes the Sarah Anderson comic. It's a hilarious comic. It's on Tumblr. It will be in the show notes. But it's an adorable little book. It's about a vampire falling in love with a werewolf and a werewolf falling in love with a vampire and living together and figuring out how to deal with each other's supernatural sides. And it's really sweet. Like, it's really sweet. Anyway, vampires versus werewolves.
It's sort of self-explanatory to a certain extent. It's
Yeah.
the trope is that for some reason, and the reasons can vary widely depending on what setting you have, there's a group of vampires and there's a group of werewolves and they do not get along. And this could be straight fantasy where they're warring states or warring clans. They can be urban fantasy. They can be like Twilight where they're two rival factions in a town. Whatever the reason, the conflict is in many times the heart of the story, and a lot of the romance ends up being Romeo and Juliet-esque because of that. It's pretty common, and I would argue, with very little research done on my part, that it comes from Twilight primarily, because I cannot remember this being a thing before then in particular. I'm not a huge fan of it, mainly because, again, a little bit fatigued on the idea. I think it would be a lot more fun, and I've heard variations on this, but of having a conflict between used to be humans and never were humans. So like dragons versus vampires and werewolves. I think that would be interesting if you're going to have an arbitrary conflict between magical creatures, or fey creatures versus pick another group. I don't know. Not my favorite trope, but definitely a very common one.
Fake creatures versus mermaids.
Perfect. Epic battles between land and sea.
Yes! Actually, fae can tend to be able to fly, right?
Honestly,
Yes?
though, like, how cute would it be for, like, a fey creature, winged or not, to just fall in love with a mermaid? And the mermaid is
adorable.
Like, okay, just imagine your ship for a moment, just meeting there on the rocky shore, and you have your beautiful mermaid character and your lovely fae character, and they're both immortal, and they both love each other, and just imagine this. It's sunset, it's beautiful, it's like a painting.
That is so nice.
Anyway.
Reminds me of the movie Ever After. If you've seen that movie and you know what I'm talking about, good for you. Okay, so basically a lot of the stuff that people talk about in fic regarding vampires is kind of like werewolves, but with vampires. There's just not a lot of like ABO or persona or spirit animal stuff.
Yeah, so if you didn't...
But they do turn into wolves and bats.
Yeah.
Which is funny.
Yeah, it doesn't have quite the same character study aspect to it, but they do get to be fuzzy animals occasionally. This is important.
They do. It's weird, though. It's weird that it's kind of similar, and yet it's not.
I have an entire thesis about that, but it is unimportant here.
Ooh. Well, I can't wait to hear it later.
Yeah, I think if you didn't listen to our werewolf episode, what we mean by they're a lot the same is that you can use the same sort of fantasy racism box to define the way vampires are sometimes treated as a trope. This is especially prevalent when they are unsubtly used as a metaphor for an STD, particularly something like HIV. So a lot of those same little boxes you can tick for werewolf world building and how they sort of get incorporated wholesale, you can flip over and use that for vampires in exactly the same way, with a vampire theme instead of a werewolf theme. So more blood, less fur.
Also, kinks.
Yeah,
I don't know why I decided to whisper that.
It's a secret. Nobody here knows that we're going to talk about kinks. They were unprepared.
Hey guys, kinks. We need to get into the Harkness test a little bit when we're talking about kinks and vampires. Basically, the Harkness Test is a litmus test for somebody who wants to fuck a fictional creature. Pardon my French. It's a way to think about wanting to have sex with a fictional creature in a safe, sane, and consensual way. Freudian slip there. So, can they talk to you? Can they effectively communicate to you, basically, in order to consent? And also, are they like mature enough with regards to their like species evolution, like species puberty or whatever, in order to have consensual sex with you? Is essentially what the Harkness Test is.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of love that we're waiting until the end of Tropetober to talk about this, because we talked about all these different types of creatures for this month. But yeah, it's important, in my opinion, to talk about this kind of stuff just in general, even though it is, just thinking about having sex with a fictional creature.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the Harkness Test is important just if you're writing any of this, I would say.
It's at least something to stick in the back of your brain, because it could be argued that most people that are morally okay with monster fuckery probably have some version of the Harkness Test in the back of their brain that they use as a judge for where their hard line stands with that. Let's do some recs.
Oh yeah, Rec Corner!
So my rec this week is a Captain America fic called Red, White, and Blue by Counteragent, and it is a story set during Captain America the First Avenger. So it's during World War II, and instead of becoming a super soldier as he is in the comics, Steve becomes a vampire. He becomes a vampire, but he still has like all of the morals and hang-ups of Captain America, and he doesn't want to actually hurt anybody, but he's also at a disadvantage if he doesn't feed on people, because that's his sustenance. So it's really interesting. It's one of those stories where it's pretty clear that he's a vampire, and that's all the symbolism and imagery and the rules that go along with it are pretty clearly there, but I don't think anybody ever actually says the word vampire in the story. It's also really very, very much a Stucky story. It's about his relationship with Bucky and his relationship to himself now that he's this thing that maybe he morally can't really condone, but at the same time he's doing massive amounts for the war effort, so he doesn't really have a choice. It ends up happily, I think. I would love to hear other people's opinions on whether or not it's a happy ending. It was an odd story. It's one of the few vampire stories that I have read. I would be interested to hear other people's thoughts on it.
Yes, if you have any recs for vampire fic that you love, just send it to mandbepresents@gmail.com. It'll be in the show notes. We'd love to hear what you think. I have a couple of recs, and they also both happen to be Stucky fic, which is fun. The first one is Our Names in Blood by OhCaptainMyCaptain. Squick alert! Please realize that there's a lot of stuff in here that could be squicky for a reader. Please look at the tags on AO3 before you read, just to make sure that you don't get squicked out or triggered or anything bad. But let me just read you the summary. The super soldier experiment results in Steve becoming a lethal killing machine. Isolated, alone, and terrified, Steve finds his way to Europe, where he learns Bucky's been taken by Hydra. When he finds him strapped to a metal slab and moments from death, Steve faces the choice: either let his childhood best friend and the love of his life die, or turn him and condemn his soul. I still think it's pretty good. It's slightly cracky. They do end up making Hitler and his wife kill themselves, which is, I would say, very cathartic for anybody who is a sane person and hates Hitler. But yeah, it's pretty good. I would say it's pretty good if you're cool with a lot of this quickie stuff about everything. Please make sure to read the tags. And then the next one is very sweet, complete opposite, but still on the spectrum of Vampire AU. It's titled Show Me Your Teeth by Leveragehunters. I think they used to be known as Monkeygreen on AO3. The summary is really adorable. Things you're supposed to be if you're a vampire. A terrifying, mysterious creature of the night. Things you're not supposed to be. Leading a tiny stubborn child home because you found him all alone in a park and you can't just leave him there. Things that aren't supposed to happen if you're a vampire. Running into the same child, except the years are passing and he's growing up over and over again. Other things that aren't supposed to happen. Steve Rogers remembering who you are, even after you fogged his mind so he forgets. But Bucky should have known from the moment he met Steve that he wouldn't be able to make Steve do anything he didn't want to do, including making Steve forget him. Now Bucky just had to figure out how Steve had remembered him and why he was so happy about it. It's very sweet. It's such fluff, and I love it. Anyway, those are the recs. Dun-dun-dun.
I guess we'll see y'all next week on
Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!